Welcome to the Senior Rehab Podcast.
The podcast for rehab clinicians that want to better serve older adults.
And now, your host, Dustin Jones.
Thank you for listening to the Senior Rehab Podcast. Today on the show, we have Ashton Applewhite. She is the author of This Chair Rocks. This book basically challenges the concept of ageism that is so prevalent in our culture and in rehab as well. She definitely busts a lot of myths of what we perceive as typical in people that are older in years, and she just has a very, very insightful perspective and very critical perspective of how our culture at large treats older individuals, which for a lot of us, that's going to be us at some point. So this is a very interesting conversation, very helpful for you in how you actually treat your patients, because our perceptions, our biases that we go into these patient encounters heavily influence how we actually treat. So I really appreciated talking with her. Her book is awesome. I've only read the first couple chapters so far, but it is great. I highly encourage you all to check it out, thischairrocks.com. We're going to talk about her book, her experiences, and just kind of the journey that she's been on up to this point. So I'll stop rambling without further ado. I am happy to introduce you to Ashton Applewhite. Ashton Applewhite, welcome to the Senior Rehab Podcast. Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Pleasure to be here.
I'm excited to talk to you because, I came across your new book, This Chair Rocks, which looks to be like an amazing read. The reviews have been awesome. I haven't got to pick it up yet, but it's definitely on my Amazon wish list. But I wanted to bring you on just to talk to me and, the people that listen about ageism and just kind of your journey in writing this book. Mm-hmm. But before we jump in, I want to ask, how in the world does one go from writing a paperback book, the best-selling paperback book in 1982, called Truly Tasteless Jokes? How do you go from that to writing a book on ageism?
Well, I think the only honest answer is I've never been able to figure out what to be when I grew up. I'm a generalist and I am a curious person. And yes. I have to say, I still do, although I'm a long, long time out of practice. I mean, I'm 63 and I was 29, or no, I guess I was 30 when that book was published.
Really?
Yeah. So, it is a lifetime ago. Not that I would disavow it. I am super, super proud that I was a clue on Jeopardy, who is the author of Truly Tasteless Jokes.
I'm going to ask my father-in-law about that if he remembers.
Well, I don't watch Jeopardy. The reason I know is my parents' phone rang off the hook with all their friends that watched Jeopardy, and like, Ashton's on Jeopardy.
That's hilarious.
Because my pen name is Blanche Knott. Okay. But then I got married, I had kids, and before that I worked in publishing. But I never thought I'd write a book. But then I just sort of became a writer by accident. I published a book called Cutting Loose: Why Women Who End Their Marriages Do So Well. And I write about things that surprise me, and when I don't understand why the culture conceives of something in a particular way. And with Cutting Loose, it was a chance question of my attorneys who said that a lot of his clients were people like me, a comment of his. And I said, What do you mean? And he said, women who are realizing they don't have to stick it out in unhappy marriages. And I went home and found out in 2 seconds that 2/3 of divorces are initiated by women.
Really?
And I was astonished. Really easy fact to find.
Yeah.
And I thought, gee, why is there this discrepancy between what we think and the reality? And the answer, the very, very short answer, is because we live in a sexist and patriarchal society. And it was kind of the same thing that happened 20 years later. I did not want to write another book. Writing a book is hideous. I do not recommend it to anyone unless you are going to write jokes down on a napkin and assemble them. That is a really fun way to write a book.
Like your first one.
Like my first one. But what got me into it was I was in my mid-50s, so about 8 years ago. And in hindsight, I realized that I started writing about aging because I was afraid of it.
Hmm.
And the catalyst was a comment, again, a chance comment by my partner's mother, who said, "Why don't you write about something people ask me all the time? So when are you going to retire?" She's a bookseller.
Hmm.
And so I started interviewing people over 80 who work. And they were a dime a dozen, and they were really interesting and, completely engaged in life in lots of interesting ways. And that didn't surprise me. But what did surprise me was how pretty much everything I thought I knew about late life was wrong. So just to finish, and I'll tell you some of those things if you'd like to know. But again, it was a discrepancy. Why don't we know this stuff? And the answer is because we live in a society that drowns out all but the negative about late life. And the short answer to why that is because if aging is a disease, well, what a market, because everyone's going to come down with it.
Right.
So there's vast medical and pharmaceutical interests that have an interest in persuading you that you can cure aging. And of course, vast commercial interests that are persuading you that, aging is a problem, especially cosmetically. God forbid you should have wrinkles, and that are selling you remedies to fix it.
When you were starting those conversations about, when should you retire? When can I retire? What was it that really shocked you? What was the fact, or
what did I learn that
what did you
shocked
learn
me?
that just flipped you upside down in terms of your previous perceptions?
This is really embarrassing to admit now, but I assumed that, of course, older people would be more depressed than younger people, because we all know it sucks to be old.
Yeah.
And also, it turns out that older people have better rates of mental health than the young or middle-aged. They were better able to moderate our emotions. We're better able to deal with stress. We're able to prioritize better. That's the underpinnings of this thing called it has various names, but if you Google U-shaped happiness curve or U curve of happiness, you will see that people are happiest at the beginnings and the ends of their lives. And this translates across nationality, it translates across class, across health status, across financial status. It is a function of being human. And that astonished me. I mean, I didn't believe it. I thought they must have cornered two 80-year-olds and given them a cookie and said, "How you feeling?" But then Google it. There are dozens of studies. And so much, for the depression. I also assumed that one reason that old people must be depressed was because they're getting closer to death. I thought that must be really scary to wake up every day and feel, the shadow of the Grim Reaper a little closer.
Yeah.
And it turns out that the older people are, the less afraid they are of dying. They don't want to die,
right.
And they especially don't want to die in pain or hooked up to a lot of machines. But the awareness that time is short enables people to live in the moment, right? To appreciate here and now the way little children do, because they don't know how to do anything else. And again, that's the reason. So another thing, I just assumed I assumed the odds were decent that I would end up in some, ghastly, grim institution. And the percentage of Americans in nursing home, which I bet your readers already know, but I assumed, 20, 30. I had no idea. It's 4%.
Right.
And the number's dropping.
Yeah.
The vast, vast majority of older people live independently until they get whatever kills them. Ditto with cognitive decline. That 4% in nursing homes, I think it's something like 3/4 do have severe dementia, which is what requires that they be institutionalized.
Yeah.
And, about 20% of older people experience no cognitive decline at all. And, most of us will. We are, problems recalling names, of course, problems, slower processing speech, slower reflex time. Those losses are real. But they don't keep the vast, vast, vast majority of us from functioning in the world just fine. The real epidemic is anxiety over memory loss. In an ageist culture, when we can't find our slippers, we think, there's Alzheimer's, And you couldn't remember when you were a teenager, you couldn't find your shoes either sometimes.
Yeah, I can't now. This morning.
Right. So we look at old age through this, incredibly grim lens that does not reflect the reality of aging for most people. And as we age, most people will say, you know what? I mean, if they think about it, I thought it was all going to suck or whatever. I thought this birthday would be so terrible, or I would miss such and such a thing. And the experience is very, very different from the inside.
And that's interesting to hear, especially, just from my perspective, because most of my involvement in older adults' lives is in the healthcare context. And so my sample size is very skewed from reality, for sure. I mean, everyone that I work with is sick. They're going through some difficult situation. And so it's definitely fed almost a fear in me of aging. Well, I'm aging right now, but in the sense of
thank you for pointing that out, so I don't have to.
We're all aging.
One of my pet peeves is the way the media labels like aging parents or aging movie stars, as though everyone else wasn't doing it right along with them.
Yeah, so that's very helpful for someone like you to be a voice, to be like, hey, this is not the norm, because for people like me and many of the people listening, it is from our perspective. And so that's pretty refreshing.
Well, the physical decline is real. I mean, there's a woman named Wendy Lustbader who wrote a book called Life Gets Better. And she says, life gets better as we age on every level except the physical. And of course, you guys are there in the trenches dealing with the reality of physical decline and sometimes cognitive decline. But I was thinking about this because I broke my wrist before Christmas and I just graduated from physical therapy yesterday.
Yeah.
And, but I was there twice a week for a long time. And I thought, it would be very difficult to be ageist as a physical therapist on one thing. Just let me point out, first, that the basis of all prejudice is stereotyping, right? That whatever group you have a negative conception about, you assume that, they're stupid or they're lazy or they're dangerous or they're whatever it is, right? I mean, the weird thing about ageism is the prejudice is against our own older selves, but that's separate from this, right? But so if stereotyping lies at the heart of all prejudice, then we have to think of all older people as alike. And stereotyping is always a mistake, but especially when it comes to older people, because the older we grow, the more different from one another we become. If you see a bunch of 7-year-olds, they're a lot more alike than a bunch of 70-year-olds. And I thought no one must know this more than physical therapists who see people with the exact same injury or, whatever. You can finish that sentence more expertly than I, and see that people react to them in different ways, heal at different rates, relate psychologically to their illness, their circumstance, their recuperation in different ways. And therefore, it seems to me it would be impossible as a therapist to lump all older people into some category, which of course is old, which is how people think, everyone in a retirement home, oh, they're old. Yeah. Well, they can span 4 decades. Can you imagine thinking about that way about a group of people from 20 to 60?
Yeah. Yeah, and I completely agree with you. We are confronted on a daily basis with the variation in, just that demographic. I mean, but what I do see in terms of if I were to coin ageism in rehab, and I'm a young therapist, I don't have the best perspective, so take this with a grain of salt. I know all the listeners will as well. But what I've noticed, and several other people have echoed, is that regardless of the variations in what we would consider an older adult, there is this kind of a mentality to where we don't want to hurt them. We don't want to challenge them too much or they will break or, will cause injury, which is a valid concern. But it's gotten to the point where our interventions aren't necessarily promoting as much adaptation as what we could be getting. So say like with your wrist, I'm sure they probably did some stretching and mobilization.
They tortured me. Yeah.
They tortured you. So they,
I called her my physical terrorist.
Oh, your physical terrorist. We've heard worse. For sure.
I'm sure. Listen, and she was doing her job, and I was grateful. I'm kidding, of course.
Right? Yeah. So she was pushing your wrist to the end range, whether it's flexion, extension, whichever range, and she was pushing it. But say a therapist would have come and only moved your wrist half as much, you probably would have gotten half the results potentially, and that can happen in geriatric rehab is kind of our term, but in terms of definitely with like resistance training and trying to build strength, that we really don't challenge our patients enough, and to where, ultimately we end up doing them a disservice.
I hear you.
Yeah. So that's kind of the basis of, of this podcast, is to bring that to light. But I'm wondering from your perspective, what's kind of the transformation of our culture in terms of how we gotten up to this point now, the history of ageism.
I think it's more. I think if we look back, 200 years ago, no one questioned the status of people of color. No one questioned the second class status of women, and no one thought about age much. Partly because there was a lot less of it. So one reason is that we are living much longer than we used to. The American lifespan, it's increased by 30 years, but a lot of that is more people surviving to adulthood. But we have, through antibiotics and clean water, stuff like that. But we have gained in a really just 2 generations, an average of 10 to 15 years of healthy life. And so part of it, is more older people. What I am trying to provoke is to say, we know that ageism still goes unquestioned, right? I mean, people know it's not okay to do or say racist things anymore, Donald Trump accepted. But, when people call themselves, say, terrible things, insulting things, that older people are useless or, smelly, ugly, really awful things, they don't even get questioned. Yeah. And, that's what I am out to change, because as a society, we have grown less tolerant, I think, of discrimination. And we've come to understand that diversity is not only, inevitable, I think, as the United States changes, which I think is, really fantastic. Yeah. I think it's one of the strengths of this country, but that it is a good thing. And, when I say to people, what are your criteria for diversity? And they say, well, of course, we want, different skin colors and different sexual orientations and so on. And I say, what about age? And there's this pause, and they go, oh, yeah, that belongs on the list. So what we need to do is bring age out of the closet, if you will, as a category. I mean, people, we believe, I think, hopefully most of your listeners, that access to opportunity should not be restricted according to what you look like. Yeah. And wrinkles and gray hair, just like physical disability. I mean, the link between ageism and ableism is tremendous, and nobody talks about it. Right? Because we're afraid of it.
Yeah. That reminds me of a previous episode. I had a couple people on talking about community design and just how the impact that can have on someone's life, but particularly we focused on the older adult, and just it's just amazing for me to have conversations with you and several other people, just to see how vast this issue is that so many people are completely oblivious to, if I'm going to be frank. But what, from your perspective, that's going to
change. My book's going to change all of that. Yes. I mean, the point I like to make about community design or age-friendly cities, as they're called, is, what I want them to be called is all age-friendly cities, because the changes we make in the workplace, older workers need more flexible hours. They may need special, they may need special, accommodations in terms of accessibility. Those are changes that benefit everyone of any age that is trying to balance, childcare and caregiving responsibilities. They benefit, if you have a ramp, that benefits delivery boys, that benefits skateboarders, that benefits moms with strollers. So this is about making society, better for everyone. It's not just about helping those poor, pathetic old people.
Yeah. So in your book, I'm interested to hear just kind of the lessons that you learned in terms of the healthcare system. Were there any facts or surprising stories that you came across in writing your book?
There's a ton of evidence that healthcare is extremely ageist. And in defense of, doctors and nurses, often those are people who are dealing with people at the most debilitated end of the spectrum. But there is a tremendous amount of evidence that people assume that older people stand to benefit less from medical treatment than younger ones, and that's not correct. What matters is not the person's age, but their underlying overall health, right? Basic organ function. Older people benefit just as much from really serious interventions, CPR, chemotherapy, dialysis, right?
Yeah.
More and more people in their 80s and 90s are getting open heart surgery and surviving at rates equal to much younger patients. So I think if I had to, the main symptom of ageism is that problems tend to be written off as an old age ailment, and that should never be the case. You guys may know a book by a gerontologist named Mark Lachs called "Treat Me, Not My Age," right? Pain, right? Lachs,
Okay.
And physicians and nurses often consider, symptoms like balance problems or constipation or memory loss. They're like, oh, he or she is old, so of course she's got that problem, when they're treatable, right? Pain is treatable. We used to think older people need less sleep. Well, it turns out often it's because, I'm not sure whether it be arthritis or what, but it's because they have more physical aches and pains. If you treat the pain, they sleep just fine, for example. And because as a society we value younger people more than older people, physicians spend less time with older patients, even though older patients have more things wrong with them and require more holistic treatment. And medication. Of course, you guys know all about comorbidities. Older people take more drugs. Those drug interactions are not studied. Older people aren't included in drug trials. I can go on, and it's really a function of this really, terrible bias that an old life has less value than a younger life, and that's, I believe that, we spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars on teeny preemies and which is okay. It's fantastic. But then question whether we should spend that on older people. And if you think about it, can you imagine a similar public debate about, well, we can spend money on Black people, but not on white people. We can spend money on straight people, but not on gay people. It would be unacceptable. It is no more acceptable when it comes to age.
Yeah.
It's not okay.
My wife's an ER physician resident, and she has a lot of interesting interactions, especially with older adults and especially their families. And what you explain is, something that we talk about a lot in terms of those situations where to intervene, to not intervene, should we or should we not? And yeah, that's a tough one. But I think you've mentioned this before of how, have you heard of conversations kind of on the bigger level in terms of health insurance, of them, willing to pay for certain interventions based on age?
I'm not an expert on that. What I can talk about is the geriatrician shortage.
Okay.
Which is also, geriatrics, every medical school requires a rotation in pediatrics. I think it's some tiny percentage require it in geriatrics. I can look it up.
Yeah.
People who go into geriatrics, I know it's 3% of social workers go into geriatrics, and when they do, they hear things like, oh, that's so good of you, or that must be depressing. The AMA surveys its members regularly according to who likes their practices the best. And doctors like to make lots of money. They like social standing, and they don't like wrestling with insurance. And pediatric surgeons and geriatricians top the list year after year after year because it is an incredibly rewarding profession. It's interesting diagnostically, and it's interesting because older people are interesting, right?
Yeah.
Right. And yet the number of geriatricians is dropping, partly because, to get back to your question about healthcare, like as with family medicine, the best care is holistic because you have to treat the older person in their surroundings because they may have a bunch of coexisting conditions, and because you have to take, as we each age, every person ages differently, physically, emotionally, and socially.
Yeah.
So you have to take their social network into consideration and their living situation. You can't do that in 10 minutes.
No, not
So
at
it's
all.
not, and also, so I mean, the Hartford Foundation tracks that every year, and the guy, this is, I wrote this in the book. It's really chilling. He said it's going to be as though, if there are not enough geriatricians, it will be as though you got cancer. If you were to get cancer, your GP, your family doctor, would have to call an oncologist and consult with them over the phone because there would be too few oncologists to meet with cancer people who have cancer, right? So it's going to become this inaccessible specialty when in fact it's deeply rewarding. And hello, the fastest growing population group in the United States is people 85 and up. Talk about demand. Why don't they forgive medical school debt for geriatricians? And why don't they do something to increase Medicare reimbursement rates, to incentivize people? Why should people suffer financially to go into an incredibly important and rewarding medical specialty?
Yeah.
It's a function of ageism. We don't care about older people and we don't value the people who work with them. And that's got to change.
Yeah. And what you said, mainly in the world of physicians, could definitely be echoed in rehab as well. We mentioned this before recording. I'm definitely guilty of this, but my desires were to be, with young athletes, work with sporting teams, and kind of go that route. And I don't want to generalize too much, but a lot of people that go into PT school have those same desires. They love the athletes. They love, that type of person, and absolutely dread working with older adults until they actually interact with them.
Exactly.
And then you realize, wait a second, this is pretty awesome.
That's great. That's wonderful to hear because, you guys are in the trenches. You're doing that. I can only speak to it socially, where people are, where older people think, oh, those younger people aren't going to want to talk to me, or we have nothing in common. And a younger person might think, oh, that old person is going to be boring, or he won't know anything about book XYZ or band XYZ or, politician XYZ, whatever it is. Talk to each other. Right.
Yeah.
It's not true. It's not the case. And it's incredibly important to make and hang on to friends of all ages, because segregation, as with race, as with societies where men and women don't, are segregated, it's the enemy.
Yeah. So you mentioned a quick tip there of just talking to people. What are some other practical tips that you would give someone like me in terms of battling, ageism in
where you have already passed test number 1 with flying colors. And it's kind of counterintuitive. It's to look for ways in which we are ageist instead of for evidence that we're not. Because all change starts with awareness. Think about the women's movement. It wasn't till women got together and started comparing notes and realized that it wasn't the size of their ovens or their husband's salaries or whether their children were blonde enough that was the reason they were feeling sidelined and unhappy. It was because it wasn't personal problems. It was widely shared political problems that required a collective political solution. The problem was discrimination. The problem wasn't being female, right? Yeah. The problem here isn't getting older. It's not aging. The problem is ageism, discrimination. But we can't get there unless we look at our own attitudes about age and aging and where they come from, because everyone is biased, especially in this culture where, everyone is racially biased. Everyone is biased in every way because you got to stand somewhere, and you're the product of your experiences. So I would say that is the very first step. Think about the language that you use. Think about, people say all the time, I don't feel old. I'm not old. The heart ageism takes root in denial of the fact that we are aging. Everyone is aging. And when we spend all this energy pretending that something that is inevitable isn't going to happen, what a waste of energy.
Yeah.
And, you said you came to my work through Bill Thomas. He has a fantastic phrase in his book that I love. He talks about the tyranny of still. And what he means is this idea that as long as we are still driving, still dating younger women, still running up the stairs, everyone has their still. It's human, a lot of them. But the point is not, that you go from running up the stairs to being bedbound, but the goalposts shift. Nothing stays the same. And if our goal is to quote unquote stay young, that is an impossible and unachievable and punishing desire that no one can possibly succeed at. And, we know up till all through life, the goal is to adapt and learn and change and grow. This ridiculous notion that somewhere sort of north of middle age, the goal becomes to like screech on the brakes and somehow magically keep everything the same. That's crazy.
Yeah.
No one can succeed at it. So along with looking, just to let go of the denial, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I call it becoming an old person in training.
I'm doing that right now.
I believe you, is just, and that old person who you were going to be can be really, really far off. It can be a speck on the horizon. Whatever distance is tolerable to you, we can only make this transition in our way of thinking at the pace that's comfortable for us and in a way that's authentic to us. But the minute we acknowledge that someday, way down the line, we will grow old, then you're over that us-them problem, right? That othering. And then you feel empathy. And then you can and then you look at older people as examples, not just as some scary, wrinkly thing that you hope never happens to you. Yeah.
I can attest to that. Just working in home health, that you're spending time with these amazing people. You learn a ton from them, but you also are just confronted with your own mortality, honestly, and it makes you think differently. And I like how you put old person in training, because that's really how I've started to think. Because I know for me, previously I was more in the sports fitness world, and I mean, we just really idolize health, and like you said, like it's going to last for the rest of our lives, and it's this could be unhealthy obsession, with how we look, with how we perform. To where you almost forget
we got to die of something.
We're going to lose those abilities at some point. Some at a different rate than others.
Some of them,
right?
I mean, there are 20% of the population, experiences no cognitive decline at all. I was staggered when I learned that. And another thing that just floors me, and it's such interesting research. And let me just say, I have been blogging about this for 8 years. My blog is thischairrocks.com. And if you click on blog, you'll go to the blog, and it is searchable. And all this research, I mean, I'm not an academic, but I am a serious scholar. And, you can find out where all this research comes from. There is fascinating research about the link between attitudes towards aging and the way our minds and bodies function at the cellular level. There are some long-term studies of people. They have found that the brains of people who were totally sharp, some of them obviously, are full of plaques and tangles typical of Alzheimer's.
Wow.
And they know what sets these people apart is a sense of purpose, a sense of engagement with life. It can be to, change the world. It can be to beat Mrs. Schwartz at bridge tomorrow. It can be to see your grandchild graduate from college. It can be to smell a daffodil, But those are people that are living with some kind of purpose. And whereas people who are convinced that getting old is just, going to be a one-way path to dependency and misery, they don't take as good care of themselves. They walk more slowly. The people with positive attitudes recover more completely from severe disability. I mean, it's fascinating. So I'm making a case in my book that because when you learn about the facts of, what I'm telling is the truth. This is not some feel-good, myths that I made up. The myths and the stereotypes that are so prevalent, those are factually inaccurate. If you, as you guys do, you're out there dealing with older people saying, yes, they move more slowly. They have injuries, you name it. You can provide the examples, but I'm sure that an awful lot of them continue to find meaning in life. Maybe they're not running up the stairs, but they're getting up the stairs, or they're sleeping in their living room, and they're finding a way. And I don't even want to say they, I want to say we, because I'm getting up there.
Right.
We find ways. I mean, I can't ride my bike as fast as I used to. I used to whiz along, now I'm in the slow lane, but I'm still really loving riding my bike, and I'm getting where I'm going. And, I don't think that's a lame apologist thing to say. I am continuing to do a version of something I love and getting pleasure out of it and getting from A to B.
Right. I like that. So I've heard you talk about your opinions on the term successful aging. I want you to talk about this, especially on this podcast, because this term, is
kind of a mantra.
Is thrown around a lot in terms of this ideal, which is vaguely defined, and personally, I think it's going to be different for each person, obviously. But what's your take on successful aging when you hear that in the culture?
Well, the root of ageism is age denial, right? We're pretending this inevitable thing isn't going to happen to us. Yeah. And at one end, it's rooted in this fear of old age as just this, descent into pathetic disability. At the other end, you have people, and I'm mid-baby boom, and I think baby boomers epitomize this, is this notion of successful aging or productive aging, that if you eat enough kale, do enough sit-ups, find some way to be productive, whether it's continuing to make money. And of course, that's a huge problem. Don't get me started. The way we equate being productive in the world with financial, earnings, when, we all help each other in so many ways that have enormous value that aren't valued in this society. Mm-hmm. But that is another form of age denial. It is another way of pretending that somehow we can avoid getting old. So that's one of my issues with successful aging. And also, it has a huge class bias. There are an awful lot of people who don't have access to gyms, who can't afford sushi, who don't live near a market that stocks kale, right? Yeah. So that's never addressed. And the third and overarching reason I don't like it is that as we age, we are hostage to an enormous number of factors that are not under our control. And the idea that you are in charge of whether or not you age successfully puts the burden on the individual, right? Yeah. And it acts as though it's a level playing field, and it's just not so. And when it puts the burden on each individual, it deflects attention from the fact that we need social structures, we need healthcare, we need affordable, you guys need to be reimbursed at different rates, caregiving needs to be valued, and caregivers need to be paid a living wage, and on and on and on, right? So that if you're having trouble getting older with whatever aspect of it is, safety proofing your home, finding somewhere to move that's affordable, getting up the stairs, you name it, your list would be far more detailed and accurate than mine. Don't just look to yourself. It's, look to the structures that fail you, right? And let's work on them. It's not your failure. It is a social and political failure, a collective political failure to fail to provide this, the support that we all need. And another problem behind it is this American idealization of independence, right? No one's independent. No one's independent any day of their lives. And the idea that we should be ashamed to ask for help is a terrible burden. So that's another thing with successful. If you're successful, you're independent. You don't need nothing from nobody. That's a pretty damaging way to think that life works when you're 20 or 40, and it's impossible when you're 80. And it shouldn't be seen as a failure. It should be seen as the natural order of things, where we all help each other in whatever way we can, and the number of those interactions that are voluntary diminishes. We do need help with more things. But, my advice on that front is to start practicing asking for help. When I go on a business trip, I force myself, it's easier now, but I force myself to ask someone to carry my suitcase down the subway steps.
Mm.
I can still lug it. I have a bad back, but I think, what am I waiting for?
Yeah.
And the person who helps me, he feels like Galahad. It's, you guys know, you help people. You come home all day exhausted from helping people, but I hope you know how grateful we are for your help. And you take something away from it. Asking for help is a two-way transaction, and there should be no shame in it. And if you need to ask for help, you are not a failure.
And for me, I see that every day, and definitely the resistance to ask for help. And that's challenging, especially, for the therapists involved and the family, the caregivers as well. Especially with, I have a lot of people in their 80s and 90s, and man, there's some independent people, and it's been tough to have that mind shift into being okay with accepting help. What would you say what would you recommend in terms of just some practical tips or advice? And
practice asking.
Practice that. What if that the patient I'm working with is in the situation where he needs help, but still is in that pursuit of total independence?
Give him my book.
All right. I'll do that. And I'll say something else too, in terms of the successful aging. You started off with the whole thought of, you are responsible for how you end up at the end of your life, in terms of every decision you've made, every piece of kale that you've eaten or weight that you lifted
or spit out
has contributed to your life at this point.
That's true. We are the product, but we're the product of much more than that.
Right. And I'll say I've definitely been guilty of trying to allow that to thrive, in terms of really, because I see it as a fine line, because we can heavily influence our physical future.
Of course we can. Right. If you don't do your exercises, you're not going to benefit from physical therapy.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah. So it's like, how do we give hope to people to change their situation, but not a false hope, a hope that has an actual perception of reality of what could come?
I think the answer is different for every individual. And I bet that every person listening to this could think of, a patient where the outcome was fantastic and an outcome where it wasn't so good.
Yeah.
And think about, and it's so individual. It depends on the temperament of the person and their circumstances, and 1,000 other things. And people have to come to these things on their own time. But wouldn't it be fantastic, if we had here's something you could say to people, is that aging, all this stuff sounds so obvious once you say it. It's just that it's the first time we're hearing it. Aging is an accomplishment. And we should be proud of having gotten to wherever we've gotten, whether you're in a wheelchair or running in the Olympics. So, and I think when you say that to somebody, that would resonate for most people. And then think about why then? Why are we ashamed? Why do we feel unsuccessful? Why are we embarrassed about having wrinkles when that is the map of our lives on our faces? And push back against that. We should feel age pride, not age shame. If we have, marriage equality, why don't we have age equality? Those are, and let people sit with those things. The minute I think, I don't think it's me. I don't think I'm deluded here. That's obviously fair. That obviously makes sense. Yeah. And I think just, when you talk to older people about, think of all the things they do well in the course of their day, even if it's just a little something, even if they're only able to take care of part of their daily needs, well, fantastic. They made it to the bathroom by themselves. Well, that meant someone doesn't have to take them there. Yeah. Or they didn't do that, but they taught that person a song. Whatever it is, it's a give and take, and they have things of value to impart.
Preach it.
I'm good. I don't mean to sound like a Hallmark card.
Well, no. It's very refreshing, and just, like you said, when you say these things, they sound kind of obvious, but just how you present them and just your passion behind it just makes you think and makes you question, especially for me, question, how do I interact with my patients and with my family and friends, and just very self-reflective. So I appreciate
Right.
it.
And,
You preach
and
all
the
you want,
sooner,
okay?
thank you. Well, I mean, so much of our fear about aging is so out of proportion to the
Yeah.
threat. I mean, the fears around physical debility are real, and that is the tiny slice of the pie where you guys live and contribute so much.
Yeah.
But all the rest of it, socially, psychologically, in terms of our self-possession, in terms of getting to know ourselves better, et cetera, gets better.
Yeah.
And the younger we are, the earlier in our life journey that we can throw off this dread that is so unnecessary and become an old person in training.
Yeah.
It's incredibly liberating.
Yes. Yes. I would agree with that 100%. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. Can I ask you some quick questions? And your responses don't necessarily have to be quick. The Twitter handle, the title of the book, where'd that come from?
It came from someone who heard my talk and said, you should call it This Chair Rocks, a friend. Yeah, I struggled for a long time with the title. And of course, it's a play on rock and roll. And it's a play on the idea of, old people just sitting in their rocking chairs and not contributing much.
Your title resonated with me because anytime I think of a rocking chair, I think of Sunday morning breakfast at Cracker Barrel with my grandmother. And I mean, it literally almost brings a tear to my eye thinking about it. So
that's great.
I love it.
I'm glad.
Who do you really look up to kind of in this little ageism sphere of the people really talking about this issue? I know you mentioned Dr. Bill Thomas. Are there any other people that you think we should check out?
Well, my book is dedicated to Robert Butler, who I don't know if his name is familiar to you. Unfortunately, he died a few years ago. But I was lucky enough to meet him a couple times and interview him. And he's the man who coined the term ageism in the 1960s. He's a physician and a geriatrician, and he was raised by his grandparents and then in medical school. And I know a number of people firsthand, and I've heard it a bunch secondhand, a lot of people who went into geriatrics or geriatric social work did so because they saw the crappy second-class treatment that older people got in medical settings.
Yeah.
And he was one of them, and it was the 60s when racism and sexism were sort of bleeping onto the cultural radar. And that's when he coined the term ageism with exactly the same intent as I have it. So he was really a humanist, and he was very helpful to me early on when I was still focused on old people who work. Because very much the conventional notion that, well, that's aging successfully, if you're hauling yourself out of bed and running your legal practice or your pet store or your whatever it is, well, then you're this positive exemplar. And he said gently, if you're getting out of bed and making yourself breakfast, that's being productive. That's doing work that someone else doesn't have to do. Maybe it's enabling someone else to go, to a paid job. That is productive. And that was very, very helpful.
That's beautiful. Robert
Butler, wonderful man. I dedicated my book to him.
Okay. Knowing what you know now about ageism and just, after writing this book, what would you tell your 25-year-old self?
I hope this doesn't sound self-aggrandizing, but I wish I had this book then I don't think I thought much about getting old. And I think part of that is just human. We age slowly. You look at it. It's like when you're a kid. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, my knees were, always covered with scabs and my shins were always covered with bruises. Yeah. And I could not understand why grown-ups sat still. It's like, why would you sit when you can be running around? Now, of course, all I want to do is sit there.
That's funny.
So I think, part of it is when we are young, it is hard to imagine that our steps will slow. But I would hope that, what I would say is cultivate friends of all ages, all lifelong, right? And make sure that you, and I mean children too. Ageism affects children too. Younger people too. Anytime you make any judgment about what someone is capable of or is interested in or what they're like on the basis of age, that's stereotyping. So it's in the book. Someone said, when you ask a child how old she is, tell her how old you are first, right? Make it an equal thing. So try to be age blind. Imagine a world in which I mean, I say this about dating, so online dating sites, and about newspaper stories. There used to be race in newspaper stories, and they took it out.
Yeah.
And they should take age out of newspaper stories too. If it's not a story about skydiving, grannies, and don't get me started on that. How successful are they? Like, if you don't want to jump out of an airplane, something's wrong with you.
Yeah.
I mean, those people are great, more power to them. But if you don't want to do that, there's nothing wrong with you.
Yeah.
It's fine to have smaller scale ambitions. So just think about each person as an individual and strip away, dating sites. I wish dating sites would take age out of the first order screening information. It could be the first question you ask somebody, but suppose you just looked at somebody and thought, I wonder if they'd be fun to hang out with. Yeah. Instead of like, oh, they're X age, therefore I have social capital depending on whether I'm older or younger. That's like having social capital according to whether you're black or white.
Yeah.
It's ugly.
Yeah.
And it's not how we should, give people access to things.
Okay, last question.
Mm-hmm.
You have every geriatric rehab clinician in the same room. You have their attention for 30 seconds to a minute. You probably already said a lot of what you would want to tell them, but to answer this question, what would you want them to know?
Well, if it was the general public, I would say I would want them to know that most of what they think they know about aging is wrong. Is based on myths and stereotypes.
Yeah.
So I guess it would be that, in your field, I would say, I guess maybe ask people to compare. I mean, I'd have to think about it, to do some sort of thought experiment, comparing their preconceptions about what it would be like treating older people to the reality. Where do the surprises lie? What ideas did they head into it with, and how have they changed? And and the bigger question is, where do, and this is not specific to your audience, but where do our ideas about age and aging come from? What social structures? Who benefits from discrimination?
Yeah,
we don't. As individual human beings, we surely do not.
Yeah, who benefits? I like that. That question, because I'll definitely have to sit with that, because the answers may be somewhat surprising to me.
Right. Sure. I mean, as long as the isms exist to preserve power structures, right? To preserve the status quo. They're not about how we look. They're about how people in power attribute meaning to how we look. So imagine if you could treat someone in a thought experiment that you don't know how old this patient is. And, you see a list of symptoms or what their injury is. How does their treatment plan or what you think of their prognosis alter if you don't know? Or how does it change when you learn how old they are and then zap in? That's what I would say. Okay, here's an age blind, guy, he has this condition, he has this injury, What's the treatment plan? Then learn the patient's age. What shifted in your head when you learned that number and why?
That's a good point. We'll leave it at that.
All right.
That's some good questions and some things to think about for me and many of the audience. And I just appreciate you taking the time to talk to me for almost an hour now.
Thank you.
But just
everything I know is in the book.
Yeah. So
This
I'm
Chair
excited.
Rocks, a manifesto against ageism.
Yes. So thischairrocks.com is where everyone can pick up the book. And tell us a little bit about the other ageist site.
My other site is called Yo, Is This Ageist?
Okay.
And it's modeled on this hilarious and really, really sharp site called Yo, Is This Racist? By a guy. He's very funny and he's very sharp, because the answer, needless to say, usually is it is racist, even when we are trying not to be, because these structures are so deep and so unexamined, so unconscious, even with racism. So it's a Q&A blog. You can submit a photo or a link or a story about something you saw or heard or perhaps did yourself. If you wonder, is it ageist? Because we've thought about it so little that it's really helpful to have examples of it. And if you've looked at it, I trust you'll you'll support me that it's genuinely entertaining.
It is. I had a solid 45 minutes on it going back through your archives this morning. So everyone listening, thischairrocks.com, go ahead, pick up the book, challenge your biases, challenge your perceptions, and just join this conversation. Ashton Applewhite, she has something going, and she is leading the charge in changing perceptions of the people that we serve on a day-to-day basis. So thank you again for your time and your work.
My pleasure.
And I look forward to continuing to support what you're doing.
Thank you, Dustin.
Hit me. Thank you for listening to the Senior Rehab Podcast. The show notes for this episode and much, much more can be found at seniorrehabproject.com. If you found value in this conversation, please share this with one other person that could benefit. And until next time, do not forget to stay funky.